What if James Bond died from blowing up a rocket in outer space to stop it from destroying a city? Or what if 2/3 of the film took place in his mind, revealing that he never actually escaped Blofeld's torture chair in the third act of Spectre? Or stranger still, what if most of the film took place in a Russian gulag that saw Bond imprisoned, like Bruce Wayne in the prison pit in The Dark Knight Rises? Believe it or not, all of these things almost happened. So to find out how we went from all of that to the movie we got, let's dive in and take a look at what could have been No Time to Die. Following the grueling production of Spectre, director Sam Mendes was completely exhausted and made it absolutely clear he had no intention of returning for another installment. This left the studio scrambling to find a visionary filmmaker capable of delivering a satisfying conclusion to Craig's tenure. They eventually turned to Danny Boyle, a director who had already proven his knack for James Bond spectacle when he orchestrated the 2012 London Olympics opening ceremony, which famously featured Craig's 007 escorting the Queen, as they famously parachuted into the stadium. To craft the story, Boyle brought in his longtime writing partner John Hodge. Their vision for the film was radically different from what we eventually got, starting right out of the gate with a chaotic, Mad Max-style pre-title sequence set in the middle of the Nevada desert during the Burning Man festival. From there, the story plunged Bond deep into present-day Russia to take the character back to his Cold War roots. The primary antagonist was a deranged Russian nationalist, obsessed with restoring the Soviet Union and installing himself as a New Age Stalin, going so far as to rebuild brutal Soviet-era gulags to imprison political dissidents. This Stalinist obsession was actually born from Hodge's own extensive research, as he had previously spent years developing a script about the real-life dictator that morphed from a movie to a miniseries and eventually a stage play. In a massive structural swing for a Bond film, Hodge's script allegedly had 007 captured, forcing him to spend the vast majority of the movie's runtime locked away in one of these Russian gulags. As development pushed forward, casting calls went out to find the perfect actors for the Russian villain, a Maori actor with combat skills to play as lethal henchman, and a female Russian Bond girl who was described as a witty survivor equipped with serious combat skills. For the Stalin wannabe lead antagonist, Boyle had his sights set on Tomas Kott, who had just starred in the acclaimed film Cold War. But this choice allegedly sparked a significant creative dispute with Bond's producers, who felt that despite the actor's recent success, Kott simply lacked the massive name recognition and box office appeal required to anchor a Bond film. But perhaps the most impactful legacy of the Boyle and Hodge draft was the introduction of Bond's child. It was actually their script that first pitched the franchise-altering idea of giving 007 a daughter, serving as the ultimate emotional anchor for his eventual sacrifice. However, in the original version, the mother was a brand new character, a choice the producers vetoed, insisting the mother be changed to Madeline Swan to maintain continuity with Spectre. This familial connection allegedly set the stage for a bombastic, tragic finale, heavily inspired by Ian Fleming's Moonraker novel, where Hugo Drax plans to drop a nuclear missile squarely on London. But unlike the book, Bond is unable to sabotage the launch from the ground. In a desperate, sacrificial final act, Bond actually hitches a ride on the launching rocket, altering its course and destroying it in orbit to save everyone below, definitively killing himself in the process. And because the final film would also kill off James Bond, officially ending the Craig era, it created the most intense casting speculation we've seen in decades, as everyone wonders who's going to be the next James Bond. But instead of just guessing, there's actually a way to see what the world thinks in real time. Kalshi has a literal live market on who the next James Bond is going to be. And what's cool is you can see when the momentum shifts in real time. Like when news drops or a rumor leaks, the odds move. It's basically a real-time pulse on Hollywood casting speculation. And the data right now is actually wild. For months, everyone assumed Aaron Taylor Johnson was a lock, but if you look at the dashboard today, he's actually slid down considerably. Meanwhile, Callum Turner has surged to the lead. I've been using Kalshi myself as a way to understand where the industry and the audience is leaning, and even take positions on who I think will be cast. And the reason I trust this data is because of how the platform is actually built. Kalshi is the largest prediction market globally, and it's the only place where you can legally trade on these kind of Hollywood outcomes in all 50 states. Personally, I'm backing Callum Turner. Like Craig, he's not the traditional Bond mold, but that's exactly why he works. He feels dangerous, less gentleman, more blunt instrument. If you want to check Kalshi out yourself and pick who you think the next Bond actor will be, just hit the link in the description and use our code BLOCKBUSTER to get $10 when you trade your first $10. That's $10 when you trade your first 10. And now, back to the video. So So what went wrong? Ultimately, the producers lost confidence in Hodge's script. With the clock ticking and a massive release date looming, they wanted to bring in other writers to do a heavy rewrite, but Boyle was fiercely loyal to Hodge, and when the studio demanded he bring in a different writer, Boyle drew a line in the sand. If Hodge was out, so was he. So rather than compromise their vision, they both walked away. With Boyle exiting the project, the studio was thrown into a massive panic. The established release date suddenly hinged entirely on whether they could secure a capable replacement within an incredibly tight 6-day window. Ultimately, they tapped Cary Fukunaga, the acclaimed director behind Beast of No Nation, to take the helm. Recognizing the immense amount of work needed to course-correct a massive blockbuster, the studio officially pushed the release date back to give Fukunaga time to completely overhaul the script. To get the story back on track, the producers brought back longtime franchise scribes Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. Interestingly, the veteran duo had actually already begun writing a completely different draft of the film long before Boyle was even hired, only for Boyle to immediately toss all of their work out the window and start fresh with Hodge. However, Fukunaga's very first idea was a massive, reality-breaking swing. He suggested that the vast majority of the film should simply be a hallucination, taking place exclusively inside Bond's own mind. In this version, the film would reveal that Bond never actually escaped Blofeld's torture chair in the third act of Spectre. The miraculous watch bomb escape and the romantic ride into the sunset were just a dying dream induced by the villain's brain-drilling needle, as everything up until the second act of No Time to Die would take place entirely in Bond's head. After the producers understandably vetoed that idea, Purvis and Wade went back to the story they were working on before Boyle came aboard, featuring a genetic bomb. For the setting of the final act, they drew heavy inspiration from Ian Fleming's You Only Live Twice novel, specifically adapting the concept of Blofeld's infamous Garden of Death, which never made it into the film adaptation. Purvis and Wade had actually been trying to shoehorn this deadly island-based botanical garden into almost every single script they had written for the franchise, even attempting to squeeze it into Pierce Brosnan's Die Another Day years earlier. But for this specific movie, the location finally made perfect thematic sense, since the central plot was entirely focused on lethal poisons. In fact, the working title for the film was Shatterhand, the alias used by Blofeld in You Only Live Twice. However, before they settled on the island-based poison factory scene in the final film, Fukunaga explored a wildly different and much more hazardous climax. One planned ending featured Safin operating out of the real-life Solovetsky Monastery located in northern Russia. This early version of the finale would have forced Bond to undertake a harrowing, bizarre underwater mission. He would have had to have swum through highly radioactive waters and physically drilled through solid concrete just to collect the deadly pathogens, before finally infiltrating the sprawling monastery to rescue Madeline and their daughter. When Daniel Craig was first approached to play 007, he was actually incredibly reluctant to accept the role. And once he did finally sign on, he naively thought his time as the iconic British spy would be a one-and-done deal, fully expecting to step away after Casino Royale and hand the Walther PPK over to someone else. However, as Craig was driving away from the Berlin premiere of Casino Royale with longtime franchise producer Barbara Broccoli, he realized the film was going to be a huge hit, leading them to make at least one more. Having not even read the contract he signed, Craig started to panic about the potential enormous multi-year commitment he had just stumbled into. So he turned to Broccoli and asked her exactly how many more films they were expecting him to do. When Broccoli confirmed that he was on the hook for 3 additional films, which would eventually become 4, Craig asked if he could kill the character off at the very end of his run, to which Broccoli agreed. However, following the chaotic, incredibly grueling, and injury-plagued production of Spectre, Craig was physically and mentally drained. His exhaustion was so profound that during the film's press tour, he infamously declared that he would rather slash his wrists than ever play the character again, bluntly adding that if he did return, it would strictly be for the paycheck. However, after taking some time away to decompress and heal from the punishing shoot, producers Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson began their campaign to bring him back. They knew that simply throwing a massive salary at him wouldn't be enough to secure his return for a 5th outing. Instead, they finally enticed him to come back by promising to make good on that decade-old agreement they struck in the back of the car after the premiere of Casino Royale, as they decided to officially kill off James Bond. However, the filmmakers were faced with a massive creative hurdle, figuring out how to actually kill him off. Early on, Fukunaga toyed with the idea of a surprisingly grounded, unceremonious death. He pitched the concept of an anonymous bullet simply catching up to Bond in the field. Thematically, it made a certain kind of gritty sense. The idea that a lethal agent who lived by the gun would eventually just meet a mundane, conventional end by a random bullet that had his name on it. However, Fukunaga quickly realized that this approach simply wouldn't work. After audiences had spent 5 films watching Craig's iteration of the character miraculously survive everything from point-blank explosions and brutal torture scenes, a standard weapons death just didn't feel appropriate or earned. If they were going to definitively kill off James Bond, a realistic battlefield casualty wasn't going to cut it. It had to be an absolutely inescapable, impossible scenario that actively forced the iconic character to make the ultimate sacrifice. When developing the film's central antagonist, Safin, the early concepts leaned heavily into pure horror. Originally, Safin wasn't acting alone during the film's haunting prologue. He was actually supposed to be accompanied by a lethal associate henchman. To disguise their identities, both characters were going to wear terrifying, heavily spiked masks, directly inspired by traditional Siberian bear hunting armor. The design was intensely menacing, making the assassins look remarkably similar to Pinhead from the Hellraiser franchise. However, as the script evolved, the secondary henchman was completely written out of the story, leaving Safin to execute the opening assassination attempt by himself. Furthermore, Fukunaga realized that the spiked Siberian mask was actually a bit too overwhelming and completely dominated Safin's overall costume. Needing something that was still deeply unsettling but visually cleaner, Fukunaga entirely scrapped the bear hunting concept. Instead, he replaced it with the now iconic, smooth white visage, based on traditional no masks from Japanese theater, an aesthetic choice that perfectly foreshadowed the Japanese architectural influences of Safin's island lair later in the film. The scene stealing CIA agent Paloma didn't even exist in early versions of the storyline. Fukunaga specifically created the role from scratch because he had been eager to work with Ana de Armas, having narrowly missed the chance to collaborate with her on a different project years earlier. Fukunaga essentially just texted the actress out of the blue, pitching the part as a quick cameo. But when she agreed to jump on board, he began building the character entirely around her, determined to give her a type of action-oriented role she had never really tackled before. However, because she was a late addition to the production, which was moving at a breakneck speed, she only had about 3 weeks of actual stun and firearms training before she was thrown in front of the cameras to shoot the massive, highly choreographed Cuban shootout. Ultimately, the sheer volume of wild, discarded concepts left on the cutting room floor proves that developing a 007 film is often just as chaotic and perilous as the spy's actual missions. And while Daniel Craig's time in the tuxedo may have come to an end, if history tells us anything, it's that somehow, some way, James Bond will return. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more of Hollywood's untold stories and unmade movies.